Hi, I'm Bruce Pattinson from the Total Education Centre. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and don't forget that these lectures are brought to you free. So if you give us a like, that'd be great. And don't forget, if you have any questions or any queries, click on the button below, write me a question, and we'll surely get back to you as quickly as possible. Don't forget, if you're a subscriber to our channel, you can get to select the videos that you want to have made, and if you really need some extra help, don't forget, go to our website, because on the website you have all the student notes and teacher notes for the topics that I'm lecturing on. These lectures are only in addition to those, and they'll give you all the detail that you require to do well in your studies. Thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoy the video. Hi, and welcome to another Total Education production. I'm Bruce Pattinson. Today we're here at the Clifton Hotel in Scarborough, a place where Wilfred Owen came after he was injured in World War I to convalesce. It's here he wrote several of his poems, and we all know him of course from his famous poems Dulcet Decorum Est, Futility, Anthem for Doomed Youth, and those classic lines and horrific stories about war. Of course, Wilfred Owen unfortunately was returned to the front and died on the very last day of World War I. But his poetry is still remembered today, and he's considered one of the greatest war poets of all time. Well, that was a lovely introduction to Wilfred Owen, and I hope you appreciated that setting and shots. Today I want to talk to you, before I really begin a close analysis of Wilfred Owen's poems, I'd like to talk to you specifically about what war poetry is, a little bit about Wilfred Owen's background and context, and something a little bit about the First World War, so you know the importance and significance of that war and why war poetry is so important. When we look at war poetry, we tend to look at poems about war, but no one's really defined war poetry, and I'd like to try and get that across to you so that it'll frame up Owen's work very clearly. War poetry could be described in two ways: poems which concentrate on the subject of war, or poems which are written during a war that seems to have had a notable influence on the poet. The definition for Wilfred Owen that I'd like to stick with is the first one, which poems that concentrate on the subject of war. Yes, it is true that Wilfred Owen was dramatically affected by his participation in World War I, but he also wrote about going to war. He wrote about coming home from war. He just didn't write about war specifically and very narrowly. And I think you need to focus on that as well when we look at the whole set of poems that you have set for study and the different poems specifically in that sort of context. The idea of when we talk about war poetry specifically, we generally refer to the poetry of World War I. And we need to think about why that was so important and why World War I was so dramatic in many ways. So the question I would ask you is, why World War I? Why is war poetry generally associated with that? Well, there were lots of poets. And you look at Siegfried Sassoon when you look at Wilfred Owen and the influence they had on each other's poetry. But the World War I was a very significant and dramatic event in human history. It was the biggest war to that point in time. It was called the war to end all wars. It was affected not only the participants, as in soldiers, but it affected whole countries. There was war on the home front. There was new weapons developed. There was weapons of mass destruction. It was a very hard, cold and brutal war that killed millions of people, and it had a very significant effect not just on the participants but those observers as well. The First World War made a huge impact on the psyche of people all around the world, but more particularly on the British, because it was very close and personal for them as well. The idea, and I'd just like to read you one section by Martin Stephen on The Price of Pity, and he summarises the horror of that conflict. He says, "The European powers were mighty in their strength and wealth. They were neither wholly good nor wholly bad, and were brought to near destruction by the powers of ambition, greed and aggression. That had always been there, but which never before had led to destruction on such a scale. The war evoked pity and terror like no other, and when peace was declared, there was an almost animal venting of emotion in the streets of Britain. It unleashed untold suffering on Europe, a suffering that went out of control on any human agency, which toppled some monarchies and shook other nations to their roots. And of course, when it was all over, the world had been made safe, and then the war to end all wars had been fought. And that's from Martin Stephen, The Price of Pity, published in 1996. And you can see, if you look at that quote very carefully and you go back over it and rewind the video, you'll see how he talks about the ultimate and significant effect on all that. So how does this affect Wilfred Owen's poetry? Well, I'd like to look now and move towards Wilfred Owen as a poet and examine what he wrote about and what he thought in terms of poetry. The videos after this will of course focus on very specific poems, but I'm going to end by talking just generally about Wilfred Owen and then move forward from there. So what is it with Wilfred Owen? We call Wilfred Owen a war poet, and his poetry can be defined in terms of he writes about war as a subject. And he was an officer in the army who ironically died on the last day of the war, and he and Sassoon are generally considered to be the most important English war poets. Owen and Sassoon met at a war hospital where they're both recuperating, as you saw at the start of the video, one of the other recuperating hospitals where they were. And they became friends and worked together, and Sassoon's grim anti-war works were in harmony with Owen's own concerns. Owen's extremely popular in modern times and not necessarily so popular at the time when he was writing. He's popular today because he condemns the horrors of war, and it's a very popular feeling these days, and certainly one that we can prescribe to. But he's also popular because he shows how people think and feel about war, and his general historical perspective on World War I, that so many lives were lost for such a little gain. And his poetry is specifically linked to those sort of historical things. He talks about significantly about the sense of loss that comes from war. Some criticism of Owen's poetry over the years was Yeats. He criticised him. Yeats said of him, "I consider him unworthy of the poet's corner of a country newspaper, and there is every excuse for him, but none for those who like him." Many people objected to Owen's anti-war sentiments, and they believed they were unpatriotic and irresponsible. They felt there was an important point to war, and Britain had to go to war to fight for the freedom of its people. And you can see why Owen's generally become more popular as times moved on in that way. Most critics, again, find his early works poor, but his later works were certainly, when he talks about the innocence of life lost and the grim realities of war, those poems are certainly far more important and far more significant than many of his earlier works. Finally, as a poet, I suppose you can call him a pacifist in many ways, and he writes against war and against the brutality and the horror and the significance and loss of life. The main focus, I suppose, if you want to narrow Owen's poetry down, is the pity of war. And you can use that phrase in any essay you talk about Owen and relate that phrase to any of his poetry. Yes, the pity of war. And the main concerns of his poetry are the waste of lives in the war and the politics behind them. He explores the soldier's experience, that disorientation, self-destructiveness, and general horror. His regret and frustration are evident, as we will see in the individual analysis of the poems to follow. So now we're going to take a break and move to the next video. We're going to look very specifically at some of Owen's poetry. I hope you enjoyed this short introduction to Wilfred Owen. I hope it helps your studies. Don't forget to visit us at totaleducationcentre.com.au. And that's all for this evening's lecture. Goodbye.